Galeotti, it's so lovely to have you on the channel. I want to talk to you about the prospects of future Putin escalation, prospects of Putin at some point even challenging Article 5. Could I get you to give me whatever might be your small elevator pitch on this issue?
First of all, let me just simply say, likewise, it's an honour and a pleasure to be on with you, actually. My elevator pitch, well, I mean, my brief elevator pitch, it's only sort of one or two stories, is let's not be stupid. My slightly less brief elevator pitch is that, of course, we need to understand the risks. But nonetheless, Putin is a believer in all sorts of weird things often, but he is ultimately a rational actor, and he is not a suicidal actor. And therefore, while he will look at all sorts of different ways of messing with us, probing us, prodding us, undermining us, dividing us, and so forth, he is not about to launch a war that I think he knows perfectly well. If he can't take Ukraine, he cannot take NATO.
My position is slightly more alarmist, but it's devoid of cartoonish idea of a war between Russia and NATO. So I think that we certainly wouldn't be talking about a territorial conflict, and we're not talking about a conflict between Russia and all of NATO, which is an entirely insane enterprise, as exactly you've pointed out. But while I think history might drift us past it, the idea of some kind of provocation by the Kremlin that's about challenging Article 5 with the hope that the West doesn't respond. So this idea of challenging Article 5 with the hope of dissolving NATO and avoiding a war with NATO, right? Not provoking NATO, is for me the sort of way I understand where we are. And I'd love to just explore a little bit whether I'm far away from you or very, very close to you. I hear you so often talk about this being a defensive war for Putin and an existential war for Putin, and a war for Putin that's a war against the West more widely, not just Ukraine. Could you say a little bit about how you see these descriptions of what Putin is doing, and if I've captured rightly that you would endorse them?
Yes, I would. And obviously it sounds very perverse to be talking about an aggressive imperial war as a defensive war. And to do that, one has to try and understand how it seems, and there's always the caveats about actually how effectively we can crawl into the dark recesses of his brain. But nonetheless, how it seems to Putin. If one looks at how he sees the world, and this is way predating February of 2022, it's very much a 19th century imperial view of the world. The world is divided between countries that in practice give orders and countries that take orders. And in that context, clearly he doesn't see Ukraine as a country that has agency. It is a country that is instructed. And time again, it's not just, I think, for the purposes of trying to mobilize the Russian people, that we see all these claims that Washington, or indeed Britain, we are after all the lesser Satan. When he talks about the Anglo-Saxons, it seems to me that MI6 is behind everything that goes wrong. I'm sure if he stubs his toe of a morning getting out of bed, he thinks that somehow that's a perfidious Albionic plot. But nonetheless, in that context, what he sees as happening is what he regards as a rightful part of Russia's sphere of influence, Russia's historical patrimony. Certainly he doesn't believe that Ukraine is a real country, and eastern Ukraine in particular he thinks is really just an annex really of Russia, the outhouse of Russia. And in that context, the fact that there was the Euromaidan, the Revolution of Dignity in 2013-2014, clearly a Western plot. The fact that Ukraine was seeking to become closer to the European Union, even if it meant reducing its economic and thus therefore political and cultural links with Russia, it's clearly a Western plot. And then now we have Ukraine wanting to join NATO. Clearly that's not because Ukraine is looking desperately for guarantees against its aggressive neighbour. No, it's clearly all a plot to try and bring Ukraine in. So from his point of view, he's actually pushing back against a much wider campaign to limit, to constrain Russia, to maybe even break it up. But nonetheless, a Western campaign against Russia that is being fought in Ukraine. So I think that's why it's a defensive campaign. That's why it's existential, because it's not just about Ukraine, it's about Russia's place in the world. And this is why it matters to him. And so, I mean, if I can just sort of push this on further, I mean, going back to your point about provoking some kind of fissure or demoralization within NATO, that means it begins to sort of unravel. Would he love to see that? Absolutely. The question is, in a way, one of resources, opportunities, and bandwidth. The idea that he could sort of somehow, I don't know, needle the Estonians, and if NATO doesn't respond in a sort of suitable Article 5 way, that the alliance will begin to collapse. It's not one that I can see through. I can't really play what I think of as a plausible scenario. I can be totally wrong, but certainly that's where I stand.
So let's broaden out this question of the potential of Putin's future escalation into a conception that I think can be helpful, and that is this question of how constitutive do we think war and escalation is to Putin's regime security. And one of the things that distinguishes people who really know the regime and people who know the region is an emphasis on regime security as one of the causes of Ukraine war. What's your sense of this? Is this a regime that can do without foreign escalation and remain stable? Or is there some sense in which it is locked in to foreign escalation, not just because 3 or 4 individuals in and around Putin might have a certain picture of the world, but also because they are just constitutively now on a path that's going to mean they'll destabilize themselves if they desist from foreign escalation. What's your sense of that question?
I mean, I think that we actually have to take apart the issue of war from the issue of escalation. And remember also, particularly in the context of a defensive war, in a defensive war, in some ways you can escalate without actually having to escalate, in that you can bring in new measures to, as you would present it, protect yourself. Because I think war absolutely has become pretty central to the whole legitimating myth of this regime. When you come down to it, what was Putin's legitimacy built upon in the past? First of all, it was prosperity. Telling Russians that essentially next year is going to be better than this year for you. And for much of Putin's reign, we've got to be honest, delivering. Now that is becoming much, much more dubious. The second element was security. That after the sort of shabby sliding collapse of the Soviet Union and the messy anarchic irrelevance of the 1990s, suddenly here was Daddy. He was going to look after, yes, the motherland, but also society and individuals and so forth. And to a degree, he also provided that in the past. Now, in a way, that too is not really a factor anymore. And obviously the Kursk incursion by the Ukrainians absolutely exemplified that. So in some ways, instead of outcomes, it moves to process. That the struggle is somehow the ennobling thing. That it's not about necessarily do you succeed in doing that, but are you committed to trying to bring that about? And I think this is great for Putin. First of all, because it is open-ended. It is not something as specific as we're going to take back the Donbass, or we're going to impose a government of our choice in Ukraine, or whatever else. It's just simply about the fact that we will be fighting to ensure that these nasty Anglo-Saxons and their various sort of puppets and proxies will not be able to impose their will on us. But also on a much more basic level, it rationalises a whole load of other processes that have been taking place. From the suppression of remaining elements of civil society and political opposition, because now essentially it's a binary choice. Are you a patriot or are you a traitor? There is no more middle ground in between. But also practical things like the seizure of Western businesses remaining, as we saw with Carlsberg and Danone and so forth. This is not just simply rapacious plunder. No, this is economic warfare, taking back resources for the motherland. And if you happen to parcel them out to people who are in useful sort of power groups and keep them happy, well, that's just simply a byproduct. So I think this is it. It's actually movement from sort of outcomes to process. And in that context, you don't necessarily need to escalate. What you can't, though, do is de-escalate. I mean, I think this is the point. I think to a degree, Putin's regime is now hooked on conflict. Doesn't have to mean a shooting war in Ukraine. Just simply the fact of just claiming that there is this cultural and political war being waged against you by the West is enough. But one way or another, this central organising and motivating principle of conflict, of warfare, of the heroic struggle, I think it's going to be very hard, certainly under Putin, to get off that particular drug.
And there's a kind of a fascicized element to this idea of war as an end in itself, which is what we're seeing so palpably inserted into the education system now.
On this fascism point, I think it's really important. Sometimes people say, "Oh, it's a fascist regime," and they mean the Nazi regime, which I don't think is a very good parallel. I think a much better parallel is the Italian fascists. This notion, because after all, Italian fascism, unlike the so-called National Socialists, did have its genuine roots in leftist movements. It was about mobilizing a proletariat, and it was this notion that, in fact, the best thing that was needed was not just a struggle, but also that you roll everything into the state. Tutto nello Stato. Everything into the state, everything for the state, nothing against the state. I mean, I think actually Mussolini's fascism and Putin's statism, particularly now that the latter is moving much more into this idea of popular mobilization, it's becoming closer and closer.
Yeah, and I think there probably are more similarities in that connection than there are in the connection between Putin and the Soviet Union. I think that what you touch on is very important, this distinction between politicization and depoliticization in Russia domestically, that is a concept I often rave on about in relation to us in the West too. Do you feel that this limbo of needing very much both politicization and depoliticization is sustainable for Putin? Or do you think that the trajectory is politicization and that that's just a place that things are moving slowly toward?
It's a really good question. And in some ways, I actually feel deeply intimidated in trying to answer it, in that you have very much made this issue of politicization something that you have built a lot of your analysis of Russia around. And being a sort of a bear of little brain, I don't want to sort of tip too much into that. My sense is that the Putinist mobilization is really a campaign to depoliticize. Because for me, ultimately, the essence of politicizing anything is to actually have agency, to have that sense that you are, for want of a better word, a citizen rather than a subject, and that you have the right to make choices. And this is very much, I think, not about that. It's not saying, this is what we think you should be thinking. This is the right way. I mean, and we see this particularly, the historian by background, as I look with a degree of not just horror, but also almost fascination, as history is rewritten and distorted, not just simply to tell the story that Putin wants to tell, but to exclude the notion that there are any alternative stories that could be told. But the point is that, again, I'm not convinced that actually that is a viable long-term strategy for any state. If one looks at Russian history, there is something of a myth about the Russian as this sort of naturally lumpen soul, doing what he's told, because when an autocrat, whether it's a general secretary or a czar or a president, tells him to. Actually, Russia's history has been one of riot, revolt and revolution. Usually precisely scattered and therefore unable to really sort of have any impact. But whether it's the Red Rooster, the arson attacks against the farmhouses of the gentry in the 19th century, or whether it's the still prevalence of wildcat strikes, so-called Italian strikes, i.e. go-slows and so forth, today. There is actually a lot more activity than we often give the Russians credit for. And to me, this is precisely about this struggle between a state that, and this predates Putin, a state that precisely wants to depoliticize its people, and people who clearly actually have an instinct to try and find some. They may not quite know what that means, but they are pushing against this idea of just simply being presented with a menu with just one dish on it.
It's always a top-down and a bottom-up question. What does it take for things to begin to shift? The feeling I often have is that you need the Russian population to develop a sense of an actionable alternative, a direction in which you can move, and that would probably require a crack at the top of the regime, together with an alternative being presented by some opposing party, not necessarily the Russian liberal opposition, and maybe with a leader in place too to articulate all of this. And we're sort of a million miles removed from that at this point. I think one of the questions that immediately sort of hovers around when we have the kind of conversation we're having is not so much what you and I think of the state of the West, but what Putin thinks of the state of the West. So I'm somebody who invests a lot in my interpretation of his view of us, because I myself feel we're in a certain kind of degree of democratic decline in the West, but I perceive a kind of dogma about Western decline at the top of the Putin regime, which I call a sort of Fukuyamianism in reverse. And that doesn't take our decline to be contingent. It takes it to be absolutely inexorable, in part because the very thing that we're trying to aspire to, various kinds of liberal democracy, are just a sham anyway. And so what would that Western collapse look like? Well, it wouldn't be a societal collapse. It would just be democratic collapse. There would be lots of Trumps and Orbans in power in major Western countries. In your analysis, am I over milking this? Do you sense something like that?
I think it's perfectly true. And look, on one level, Putin believes it because he needs to believe it. Because in many ways, here he is tangling with an alliance which is vastly more powerful on pretty much any index you would want to count it, whether it's economic or military or soft power or whatever. But he needs to believe that there is a point of weakness, and for him that is precisely that we're a constellation of democracies. So in part, anyway, this is whistling in the wind. But it is also, I think, a genuine view. And I think it mistakes, look, and there is no question, as you raised, that basically we are in a period of something of a democratic crisis. And I think in part it's because, look, we're still soldiering on, ultimately, with systems that have their origins in 19th century class politics. The old era of the factory and the farm, and this notion that political parties can be constituted around identifiable classes, and basically class solidarity and units such as like trade unions and the like can deliver the votes. And that is not the world we live in now. And we haven't yet really worked out how democracy can modernise itself to appeal to that. But this is the point. I wouldn't say, therefore, this is the death of democracy. I think this is precisely something of a transitional moment. But to Putin and those around him, I think precisely they look at all the travails of democracy. They look at the presence, not just of Viktor Orban in Hungary, but other leaders who in some ways are rather Orbanic, who are emerging as a result of this, and sees it precisely as proof of what they've always believed, that essentially democracy is something of a sham, that it does not ultimately work, that it is inefficient, when in fact, in many ways, democracy is actually markedly efficient, and that clearly they are not relics of the past, which is definitely how I would consider them. I mean, very much kind of largely Putin and his co are the last gasp of Homo Sovieticus, but rather somehow the advanced harbingers of the future. And look, it's flattering to think of yourself in these terms. Who of us wouldn't want to think of ourselves as the sort of the next generation rather than anything else? But the problem is when this moves from being a political and philosophical discussion into a bedrock of political assumptions. And I think this is the problem, that Putin and his cohorts have locked themselves into a policy basis that assumes that the West is ultimately weak, fragmented, prone to being distracted, all of which are true, but only true up to a point. Are they people who are able to be sufficiently self-critical to think, okay, we may have misunderstood? Everyone was surprised, actually, at the unity and activity that was demonstrated by the West in February 2022 with the sanctions regime and so forth. So are they able to think, okay, maybe we need to reassess? I've seen no evidence of that.
I mean, my sense is that Putin, on balance, is thinking that even though he's having a difficult time, he's probably winning, just about, but slowly. When we talk about that regime, do you think that there's quite a bit more there than just preoccupation with regime security that may encourage the regime to escalate? Now, one of the words I use very often about these guys is mysticism. And that's to say that I am trying to get my audience, at least, to shift their gaze from an old sort of model of Soviet leaders, which to a good extent could be understood through an almost economics type rationality model you could get in an international relations textbook. And so I say, look, in part, you've got to leave a little bit of space for thinking about these guys as radically theological somehow, or at least having an element of something apocalyptic, having an element of something that is in the direction of religious fundamentalism and away from what we've got used to with the Soviet Union. I even think of risk of nuclear escalation as being affected by this consideration. A couple of images I often give about this are the following. One is just that Putin thinks he is Russia in a kind of Wagnerian way, right? The collapse of cultural self-realization into essentially the will of a single individual. And then another idea is some kind of idea of propulsion of Russia from the back row of nations to the front row of nations in a single swoop. In the way I've just cast this, there's no doubt that they're rational, but are they nutcases in this way that I'm describing?
I mean, I think there is a strong mystical element. And if you talk about exactly this issue of Russia's place in the world, I mean, it's clear there is this notion that Russia is a great power. And it's not a great power because it has a nuclear arsenal or whatever else. It has a great power because it is Russia, and that this is its birthright, and that Russia has acted as the saviour of civilization time and time again, whether it was from the Mongols in the 14th century or Napoleon or Hitler or whatever. And ultimately this earns it the right. And this is precisely part of the reason for the particular bile with which Putin talks about Western attempts to marginalise Russia, to, as he sees it, deprive it of its rightful place in the world. But more broadly, I mean, in some ways, I would actually push back against the notion that the Soviet regime was not mystical.
Interesting.
Because in many ways, communism is a religious concept more than anything else. But the interesting difference in the, shall we say, the mysticisms was that Soviet communism was explicitly global. Yes, we had the socialism in one country interval of Stalin's, but essentially it said, look, this is a universal set of values that at some point will be experienced across the world, which we don't get with the particular brand of mysticism that is held and practiced by Putin and his circle, and indeed many others within Russia, which is actually one of exceptionalism. They're not sitting there thinking the French should all become Russian Orthodox. I mean, in some ways, a central element of Putin's philosophical thesis, for want of a better word, is precisely that Russians do it better. You know, we have European values, but we have true European values, not like those ghastly woke figures just across our border. And yes, we think that they should be more like us, but it's not our job to convert them. I mean, I think this is one of the key differences. There's much less of an evangelical tone to what we get from Putin. And even if you look at what the Russians are doing, say, in Africa, well, they are clearly working with the grain of a whole variety of often kleptocratic and authoritarian regimes with whom they can naturally get along. But even then, not actually as if we see much of an effort the way that the Soviets did in their activities in the global south of trying to say, you should be more like us. It's just, look, let's make deals, let's be politically transactional. We all agree that we don't like Western hegemony. Let's move on from there. So, I mean, I think this mysticism is incredibly important. But firstly, as I said, I don't see it as an evangelical variety. Nor is it, I think, an eschatological variety. I don't think it naturally heads towards Armageddon. Mm-hmm. Now, maybe it's just because I too would like not to believe that. But I think that when it comes down to it, you know, I don't get any sense that the kind of vision of Russia that they have is one that, well, if we can't be what we want to be, then we'll let the whole world burn. You know, when it comes down to it, you know, Putin and co are self-interested, self-indulgent despots, rather than, I would say, ayatollahs. There is an element in this ideology which is fundamentalist, in the sense of that it excludes all sense of room to be questioned, and it has this sense that it is a natural, revealed truth. But I do get the sense that the people at the top are more instrumental in how they use it.
So I think we've covered some of the central issues that pertain to this question of what, if any, conflict we might expect between Russia and NATO. And one of the things we emphasized was Russia's view of the West. We talked about the connection of regime security to for an escalation. And we've talked about the degree of mystical nuttiness we might find there. And I hope you're more right than I am about that. And we also implied throughout our conversation opinions about the degree of proprietorial attitude that the Kremlin has toward various places, such as East European countries. And I think your view of that also is going to impact a conversation about how seriously the Kremlin might take the integrity of NATO over the years to come.
While we disagree to an extent on the likelihood of Putin sort of posing a much more direct challenge to Article 5, I do think that we need to appreciate the extent to which that doesn't mean to say that Putin regards Western societies as bulletproof. I mean, he absolutely will be looking for further ways to undermine our will, to distract us and to demoralise us. We've already seen this year in particular an escalation in sabotage attacks and the like, and sort of not just assassinations of Russian defectors that Putin seems to regard as not just a right but a duty, but also claims that there are attempts to, for example, assassinate a German industrialist. I think in this context, this is where I think that we will see escalation in what, in sort of the jargon, is sub-threshold. In other words, nowhere near Article 5, no tanks near borders, but increased use of covert means, and in particular what I'm calling the weaponization of inconvenience. A sense that precisely it's become too easy for the West. We metaphorically write a check every month to the Ukrainians and they go off and do the fighting and the dying and the killing. But it's rather distant from our day-to-day life. Line between, chunk of money being sent to Ukraine and a hospital not being rebuilt or a road not being resurfaced isn't really very evident. Well, I think what we're going to see, and certainly there's chatter in Moscow to this effect, is an increasing attempt to make us feel that, in fact, this war does impinge on our lives. And therefore, whether it's interfering with train services or slowing down internet speeds or all these other things that, in and of themselves, they sound trivial compared with the horrors of what's actually going on in Ukraine, but nonetheless are precisely made to make us feel that actually, this war is inconvenient for us because, again, part of almost Putin's faith, it is that Western societies are inconstant and that they will not accept costs to do something that they might think otherwise is kind of morally right. I think we will face escalations, but of a very different order from the kind of the military variety. We'll have to just wait and see.
I think we've done a great job. And what I want to say briefly to everybody watching is that our security depends not on your particular view of what best protects our security being emphasized, but on free thought and free discussion about this. My next conversation with Mark will not be about an issue, but it'll be about talking about issues and the gamification of the Ukraine war on the internet and the behavior of experts and all of us on social media. And for that, you click here when it appears, and until then, my propaganda video will be here.